Wuchang Fallen Feathers is one of the souls-like games of all time, but I don't necessarily mean that it's a bad video game, just that it's doing nothing new. It's a fine souls-like game overall, but throughout the entire game, I had the distinct feeling that I had played this before. I've fought that enemy archetype before. I've seen that hot chick boss that shapeshifts into something else for its surprise second phase. Nothing Wuchang did shocked me or made me think about this genre or game in a different or meaningful way. You play as a mute main character, you wander around aimlessly, defeating bosses, getting cryptic clues and information about who you are and your role in this world, and on your journey you use souls to upgrade yourself, which, man, that I did not enjoy, more on that later. But unfortunately, the biggest criticism I have about Wuchang Fallen Feathers is that it's basically every souls-like game you've played before, and once again, I want to stress that isn't necessarily a bad thing.
That is sacred, not for your hands. Will this immense power consume you, or will you conquer it?
Let me know any questions you have about the game in the comments down below and I'll try and get back to you. Also, this video won't be highly edited as my typical reviews are because I've been traveling for the Dying Light preview, which you should go and watch if you haven't, but that's also why I haven't actually finished Wuchang Fallen Feathers. I've put 25 hours into it so far, and I feel pretty confident about my opinion right now on the game, and I don't want to make this like a distinctive review as if I finished the game. I want to be upfront about that I haven't at this moment, but I will leave a comment down below once I have rolled credits if anything has actually changed around my opinion. But where I am at the moment, like, I don't think the game's going to drastically change at this point, as I do feel like I'm basically right at the end. But firstly, we'll go over the technical deets as we always do. How does it run? How does it perform? Pretty okay, I think, generally. On my RTX 4090 machine, I'm sitting at like 60, 70, sometimes 80, 90 frames, depending on the area and how many particle effects there are, as some of the areas are significantly more intensive than the others. Conversely, though, I do want to warn you that depending on your hardware, you will definitely have a lot of inconsistent frame timing and just general FPS across the board. So because I was traveling for the Dying Light event, right, I brought my laptop as I planned to continue playing while I was traveling. Could barely get a consistent frame rate on my laptop, like anywhere from 30 to 70 frames, regardless of the settings, whether I was running at 1080p or 1440p. And that was probably the area that I was up to, as I was in quite an intensive area with a lot of particle effects and snow and everything. But it's just something to be very mindful of, is that the performance here is probably going to be very inconsistent the lower your hardware is. I also even tried to run this on my ROG Ally, and that was just not really playable either. The problem is that yes, like, you are above 30 frames per second, and, you know, like, for the most part it's a playable experience. But in Souls-like games, when timing is so critical, when being able to read animations and perfect dodge the enemy attacks, because that is a critical part about this game, is being able to perfect dodge attacks to build up your Skyborn might. More on that, we'll get into that later. But essentially, like, this game is a difficult game, and it forces you to animation read very carefully, and it's really hard to do that when the performance is very wildly inconsistent and ranges from anywhere from 40 frames to 60 frames in the span of 1 minute, right? So I really struggled while I was traveling for the event to actually continue my playthrough. I tried, it was really tough. It wasn't until I got home that I was able to actually put more hours into it because of how wild that performance was. So I do want to stress that your mileage is probably going to vary significantly depending on your hardware, but, you know, if you have a RTX 4090 like I do, you're probably going to be fine, but I understand that most people don't. Outside of that, though, environmentally and like the game itself is quite diverse in its landscapes. You know, you'll see anything from swamps filled with status effects that are going to absolutely destroy you, to caves, snow-capped mountains, forests, general palaces. Like, there's plenty of environmental diversity here, and it all looks fantastic. It is an Unreal Engine game, which you kind of expect these days, that they all look very nice and pretty to look at. There's a couple of really nice vistas where you can see future areas that you're going to explore, and when you actually reach those areas, it's quite rewarding to be like, oh, you know, I remember seeing that in the distance. But I want to spend most of this review talking about the two main things that are important for Souls-like games. The first of those is combat. Now, combat in Wuchang Fallen Feathers, not to be confused with Wulong Fallen Dynasty, is a Souls-like game. It's everything you expect, right? The camera is third person. You're going to walk around. You're going to lock onto things. You're going to swing your attacks at the enemies. They're going to swing them at you. You're going to try and avoid them. You're going to use your Estus Flask to heal, collect your souls, level up, usual shenanigans here. Now, while you've done all of this before, there's a couple of things that I think will not necessarily shock you, but will mildly annoy you throughout your experience as a seasoned veteran in the Souls-like genre. One of them is the weapon reach, because basically every weapon here has such a low reach that it doesn't make sense. Like, regardless of the weapon you're using, it took me quite a long time to get used to the fact that I have to be basically like hugging the enemy to actually hit them, until I did find a longsword that had like additional like whip attack that used the same animations, but it had much more reach, and that just significantly improved that. And as soon as I found that longsword, I basically never took it off because it just fixed that issue for me. Outside of that distance management, which never feels consistent, animations across the board are pretty average and, not clean sometimes. And the reason that this is part of a problem is because of two things. One, it's because of this Skyborn Might mechanic, which essentially what this is you need to perfect dodge attacks, or if you have the right upgrades, you can gain these Skyborn Might, like these feathers, via your just like general light attack combos. Now you want to gain these because you'll then use them for your weapon skills, or you might use them for spells depending on what sort of build you're running, right? So you have to either perfect dodge or attack the enemy in a certain successive attacks, like 2 to 3 times, to get like a trigger, to get like another stack, and then you dump those stacks into like your weapon skills or your spells, right? Now, because you either need to perfect dodge these enemy attacks, or you need to make sure that you are hitting with your attacks in between, like weaving them in between the enemy attacks, it's very important, as with every Souls-like game, that the animations are clean, easy to read, and the hitboxes make sense. That is not necessarily clear here. On multiple occasions, I thought I shouldn't have got hit by something and I did. I thought I hit the enemy and I didn't. I thought I perfect dodged something and I didn't. And this is really exemplified by the fact that there is the ability to block as well as like counter and deflect. Countering and deflecting, like the sword counter, for example, that I used a lot throughout my playthrough, is wildly inconsistent around what attacks you actually can counter and deflect and what attacks you can't. And there is no clear way that this information is represented to you as a player. Now, a lot of games, especially Souls-like games, have already solved this problem, where there are attacks that you say can't deflect or counter, and it either tells you this via a sound effect, some sort of particle effect, color variance, whatever that may be. The game gives you that information immediately so you can read and react. The problem that Wuchang Fallen Feathers has is if you are running like a sword counter deflecting build like I was, this isn't clear. Essentially, it borders down to the fact that if they're attacking you with a sword, you can deflect or counter it. And if it's not, even if it's the same enemy, but they decide to kick you or punch you or anything like that, you just like can't deflect it or block it, and the attack will just hit you, like regardless. And look, that's fine if that is the way this game wants to treat that mechanic. But it makes it really frustrating when you're constantly fighting new enemies throughout the game, and every time you have to relearn what attacks you can actually deflect or counter. And it's the same with bosses, right? And there are a lot of boss fights that I just didn't even bother, and I just completely changed my build because, I just didn't want to figure out and stand there and essentially die multiple times trying to figure out what I can counter and what I can't counter and how that works. And it's just a little disappointing when we've seen Souls-like games and action games in general know how this works and like treat this in a way that makes sense for the player experience to be much more enjoyable. I get maybe they're just going for like trying to make it harder, but it doesn't feel rewarding when you essentially just die to enemies over and over again because you're trying to figure out whether you can counter this or you can't. Like, you may as well just not counter and use a different build, right? For combat, there is a couple of other things that Wuchang does. One of them is the madness mechanic, which is represented on the left-hand side by the figurine of Wuchang that will fill up red if your madness is high. Now, your madness increases when you die, and especially when you're fighting bosses that you're going to die multiple times. The higher your madness, the more damage you take, but also the more damage you deal, and you'll gain more souls when you defeat enemies. However, if you die with a high madness, when you go back to where your souls were, a spirit or demon version of yourself will spawn, and you'll need to defeat them in order to get your souls back. And this demon will spawn at certain other times throughout the game as well. That will give you various rewards when you do defeat them. I was generally hoping there was a little bit more depth to this madness mechanic, like maybe it changed the world space in any particular way, or did something other than increase the damage you take and the damage that you deal and give you a little bit more extra runes, as it doesn't really have much of an impact throughout your entire experience. Once you get the hang of combat, very rarely does this madness mechanic ever really play a part. Like, there was one time in the many difficulty spikes that this game has, which, you know, there are a lot of difficulty spikes where you're just moseying on through, clearing areas, defeating some minor bosses here and there, and then you'll just reach a point that is like 10 times harder than that previous area or boss that you were fighting. But on one of those occasions, I actually reset my madness because I wanted to lower the amount of damage that I was taking in that fight, just to see if it made a difference. It didn't really. I did end up beating that fight with a high amount of madness anyway, and basically every boss that I've struggled with when those difficulty spikes do occur, I've been able to beat them with a high madness, and it doesn't really make that much of a difference overall. And also, you kind of want to have a high madness because in your skill tree, it does actually affect some of your skills. But despite these complaints, I did still enjoy the combat system. The level design here is quite exceptional. There are plenty of diverging paths with a lot of shortcuts that connect you back to previous areas. The enemy placement is quite solid beyond a couple of annoyances where you've got these really challenging enemies next to these like archers and they just absolutely destroy your face. But for the most part, the enemy design here and placement is quite solid and enjoyable to explore the world, find all of your little nooks and crannies, find those upgrades, and just generally progress through the world space, which is good because I didn't actually enjoy the core progression mechanic. So the progression and the skill tree is one of the major criticisms I have of Wuchang Fallen Feathers. Now, when I was at Summer Game Fest, I was sitting there playing the preview build, and the developer was talking to a gentleman next to me, talking about the skill tree, and very happily and like bubbly, he was like, "Oh, you should check out the skill tree. You know, Path of Exile? Yeah, our skill tree is exactly like that." And as soon as I heard that, I was like, "Oh my god, I do not want to play this game," because that just scares me. And Path of Exile is just a web of skills that most of them are meaningless. And I was quite worried that's what Wuchang Fallen Feathers was going to be. And unfortunately, that's basically what it is. It's not as deep and wide as a Path of Exile skill tree. However, essentially here, both your attribute progression, your skill progression, your weapon progression is all tied to this map of skills. Now, I talk about progression a lot in all of my RPG videos because I think it's such a critical part of making a successful game in this genre. Now, the problem with Wuchang Fallen Feathers isn't that they have made a skill tree that looks like Path of Exile. It's that they have tied all of the progression to this one skill tree. That includes your weapon, like leveling up your weapon's actual level to increase the amount of damage it does. It includes your attributes and leveling up your attributes. It includes your weapon skills and unlocking those weapon skills. It includes your flasks, leveling up your flask, etc., etc. Everything, including like the temper mechanic, which is like to do with the feathers. It's all linked to this one tree. Now, that on paper sounds good, maybe simple. The problem that I have with that is it lowers the feeling of build discovery. Now, think about any of these Souls-like games that you know about, right? Like, well, let's just use Elden Ring as an example. Let's say you find a brand new weapon and you pick it up, you look at that weapon skill, you investigate it, and you're like, "Oh, this seems really cool. I wonder if I could use this." And you're like, "Oh, okay. Maybe I'm invested right now in a strength build, and this is a dexterity weapon. Well, I guess I'd have to respec into that." Right? Now, luckily, Wuchang Fallen Feathers lets you respec at any time. You can completely just like take off one node, move that one node to somewhere else. It's totally fine. The issue is that there are the 4 weapon types, being the longsword, the twin blades, the axe, and the spear. These are the 4 weapon trees. Regardless of which longsword you are using, you will be leveling out the exact same skills, right? And you'll progress all through those. Now, they give you your attributes, your skills for the longsword, any passive buffs or like uniqueness for that weapon, just in that one tree itself. And if you want to switch your longsword at any time, you totally can, and it literally makes no difference, right? Like all the longswords will always be at that same like tier level because you've leveled out that skill tree, right? And the problem is that there's no real discovery or tinkering with builds or anything like that here. It's like, oh, I like the longsword animations. I'll just, level out all of the skills in the longsword tree and like, that's it. And essentially like the best advice for like, leveling yourself up in this game is you just invest in one skill tree because that's all you need to do. It gives you all of the attributes you need. It gives you all of the weapon skills you need. It levels up your weapon because that's all a part of that as well. And then you don't have to think about anything else. And I kind of understand the thought process of simplifying the leveling process in a Souls-like game, because often, understanding attribute scaling and leveling up your weapons separately and then how that interacts with the attributes and then thinking about, all this stuff to some regard is complicated, but also that's part of that discovery process, tinkering with the build, understanding your character and the role you're trying to play and how you're going to play that character. Whereas essentially here, when I realized that I just wanted to use the longsword because it had a solid amount of reach and the attack animations were a little bit quicker than the others. And, I wanted to occasionally use a spear, so I had the spear in my offhand. I essentially just leveled all of the longsword skills and then a little bit into the fast skill line, and then that's it. Like, I just didn't feel the need to change anything, tinker with anything, because there's no need to tinker here. You gain your levels, like when you go back to the shrines, you gain your level and you just pick the next skill in that next line, because it's all linear. Like, there's a couple of deviations depending on if you want to use a different weapon skill to the one you're already using, but essentially it's just a linear skill tree that you follow through in that specific line. Because why would I choose twin blade skills when I am using a longsword? Do you know what I mean? I just think that's a little disappointing, and it could have been more complex. And it's interesting that I felt that this was going to be more complex because of how it was described at Summer Game Fest, but ultimately it's quite simple. There is still some depth to the armor that you choose, specifically whether you're looking to have a high amount of physical resistance or you're trying to prevent a status effect from triggering, which there are lots of status effects that will trigger if you don't wear the right sort of armor for certain situations. Then there are pendants that will give you minor buffs to certain parts of your build, but it could just be a little bit of extra stamina recovery, maybe a little bit of extra stamina. There is one pendant that will prevent you from flinching when these like beast enemies do raw attacks. So there is a bit of depth there to that system. But the main problem I have is that this system with the armor and the pendants, the discipline skills being like your weapon skills, and then this skill tree, as long with the tempering, which is like the needles you can put into your arm, which will give you certain buffs when you trigger like the temper ability, plus the runes that you can put into your weapons, it doesn't coalesce to me into a really fun and enjoyable build discovery system where I'm really tinkering and trying to find like the best build. I was basically just able to slap on my longsword, put some runes on it, use the same temper that I got at the start of the game, and I was able to just kind of roll through. The feathering is a disease that has infected everyone, turning them insane or into monsters, except for Wuchang, who has lost her memory but gained the feathering powers. Wuchang is simply an attractive vessel for you to play. There really isn't a lot of character depth behind this mute character, nor a compelling narrative that's going to pull you through this journey. There is definitely lore and some world building, especially told through boss armor descriptions and all that stuff that you've experienced before. But where I'm at in the story right now, and despite the revelations around Wuchang's character itself, I just haven't felt any real connection to the narrative or the journey that you're on. And the game's story is told through those exact methods that you would expect from a Souls-like game, through cryptic NPC dialogue and just talking to a door. And, it's all been done before. And I don't mean to sound like I don't like this genre. I love Souls-like games, but I just find it quite disappointing that we're not trying anything new here. In the story, the combat, anything. Like, I guess, in the progression, they definitely did try something new, and in my opinion, didn't work. But in a genre like this, where everything is very similar to games you have experienced before in this exact genre, I personally have found it hard to connect with a new character in a new universe doing the exact same narrative, structure, and story and design that I've experienced before, and to be honest, done better. Now, to this point, you're probably thinking, man, you hate this game. And again, I want to stress, I do not hate Wuchang Fallen Feathers. It is a fine video game. There is absolutely that fantastic dopamine hit you get when you defeat those difficult bosses. There is some fantastic boss intros where you walk into a boss arena and the boss does that, cool thing that you expect in every FromSoft game or any Souls-like game, where the boss like stands up and says some cryptic dialogue and just like looks incredible. Like, there's just this epic pan shot, this fantastic character model, and you're like, damn, that's amazing. Now I'm going to fight this thing. How am I going to beat it? You eventually beat it. You get that dopamine rush. It's very exciting. And then you move on to the next challenge. All of that stuff is here. All of it feels great. The problem is, as I mentioned, you've done all this before. You've fought a lot of these bosses and enemy types before. There's actually quite a lot of the trash enemies that I've felt here that you know, I've simply just fought them before. Like, they have attack patterns and designs that I just remember doing, like, you know, the slow moving enemies that put their hands up and grab you, the dogs that bark and then jump at you, the axe wielders that spin around in a circle really slowly. It's just all archetypes that I feel like I've experienced before. Again, it's not necessarily a bad thing. This is a fine Souls-like game, and if you love this genre, you will find a great enjoyment playing Wuchang Fallen Feathers. And that's ultimately why, like, if you like Souls-like games, I do recommend that you give Wuchang Fallen Feathers a shot, especially on Game Pass, because it is on Game Pass. You will definitely get your hours worth here. There is a solid Souls-like experience here that if you love this genre, you will enjoy this game. And I did personally enjoy my time with Wuchang Fallen Feathers, but I just wanted to point out that everything that I've done in this game, I've done before. And I think as a genre, as a Souls-like genre, we are being very stale when we're just putting out these Souls-like experience that are exactly the same experience that we've done before. We just have a brand new shiny main character that we're going to play as. But let me know your thoughts on Wuchang Fallen Feathers in the comments down below. I do also urge you to check out other reviews, as you know, as always, my opinion may be different to others. My opinion may not match your own. This is my opinion, and you shouldn't take it as gospel. But thank you guys for watching this video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is NorZZa, and I hope you have a great day.